Hello, I'm Andrea Phillips. If I speak like this, can you hear me?
Yes.
Like this? Thank you. Well, you're close. So, can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, this panel is going to move on from the discussions that have, the ideas that have been introduced by Maria and Simon earlier on. And really, I think we're going to be focusing on institutions and concepts of the we within a UK context. For us, I think, as a panel, and I will introduce, I will point at our panel in a minute, because we've decided, because various people are showing images, we're not all going to sit down until the discussion point. But I think this panel, in a way, is going to start from a focus on the UK context, specifically. But it's interesting to think about the questions that Former West asks in the context of the UK, and specifically in relationship to questions of race and the way in which race is instituted through arts institutions. This is going to be the focus of what I'm going to say, and I think it's going to be picked up in various ways by members of the panel. So just to introduce the panel, we have, and you have their biographies in your handout, so I'm not going to go into details, but speaking after me will be Morgan Quaintance, who is a curator and a writer, who's sitting down here. So I'm just pointing so that you'll see him in a minute. And then after that, Barbie Asante, who is an educator, curator, and an artist, sitting here. And then finally, Irit Rogoff, who's a professor in the Visual Cultures Department and a curator, sitting over here. So we're each going to come up and talk, and then we will gather together on the comfortable chairs and have a discussion with you all. And we've got until 1 o'clock, so we have a bit of time to get going on this. Okay, so as I said, the panel will discuss the construction of a we in terms of current issues of race in the UK, with specific reference to the historical and institutional paradigms developed and maintained through contemporary art. So already that's quite complex. How is race constructed through the paradigms of contemporary art, recent and contemporary art, we could say, within the establishment of modernities that the construct of Former West is set up to dispose, displace, dissipate in many, many ways. So how can we think these concerns, contemporary art and race, in relationship to the question that Former West has asked forcefully and imaginatively since its inception, which is, how can we think beyond this? How can we think beyond the Western hegemony and acknowledge its passing, to quote the Former West literature? How can we think beyond the Western hegemony, which includes the construction of race within contemporary art, I would say, and acknowledge its passing? What is that passing, is my question, and can we talk about it? And can we talk about it specifically? And here I think our location, and in a way Former West's coming to rest in London in the UK for this weekend, how can we think about these questions of race, of histories of migration, and of histories of colonisation within the UK context, and perhaps specifically the London context, in relationship to these questions? Okay, so the other thing I want to say is that there's something that brings the panel together beyond our interest in each other and the questions that Former West poses, which is that we have all in various ways been involved in the history of, the development of, and the critique of a particular arts institution in the UK, which is called the Institution of International Visual Arts, which is currently housed in Rivington House in Shoreditch in London, and was set up in 1994. I will talk a little bit more about its construction and its setup a little bit later on, but we have all variously been involved in the development of that project, the Institution of International Visual Arts, and are also gathering together in various ways at the moment to think about its future. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, and we'll come back to it. We're not all going to speak about Innova, but it's one of the ways in which we've come together, and we have met together. Okay, so this short paper is called Complications of Identity-Led Inclusion in the Arts and the Dumbing Down of Cosmopolitical Discourse. Okay, so just to say that this focus on the UK is not meant to be parochial, although, of course, many focuses on the UK are parochial. But it's to acknowledge, and of course I recognise that I'm focusing on the UK within an international audience. But it's to focus on, to identify the specificity of histories of colonialism within the UK and London specifically, the histories of economics, migration, the histories of the ways in which the deeply embedded roots and legacies of colonialism are not former in the UK but continue. So it's to think about these questions of the former within that context, where we cannot displace or dispose the histories and the violences of colonialism that are still ongoing within the UK project and its globalisation. So it's specifically within that context that we're talking. So we know, as Simon has already referred to, that there's still huge amounts of racism within the UK, within the arts, as well as within the broader context, and that we are currently witnessing the violent rise of what we might call the reasonable right wing, the acceptable right wing within our community. And of course, we have an election coming up. Okay, so I'm going to start by quoting from Peter Bazalgette, the current chair of the Arts Council of England. So sorry for those of you that live under or outside of different funding regimes, but the beginning of my paper is going to be focusing on the Arts Council of England. So I'm going to quote from a paper or a talk that Peter Bazalgette gave at Sadler's Wells, which is a house, a centre for contemporary art, an expensive building for contemporary art in London in December 2014. And what Peter Bazalgette was doing was launching something called the Creative Case for Diversity. Okay? I'm going to do something that's very naughty, which is I've taken certain parts of his talk, which is published online. You can get it very easily if you Google Peter Bazalgette Creative Case for Diversity. And I've kind of reduced it somehow, so it's academically dodgy. Okay, so let me do it anyway, okay? So this is a quote, quite a long quote, that comes from his speech. "We have some outstanding leaders from minorities. We need more. But the doorway into the arts can be hard to find. And beyond it, there are few pathways for progression and many economic dead ends. It is a frustrating experience. Looking up, many see the white cliff face of the arts establishment and feel that they just cannot climb it. But from 2015, measured action on diversity in arts and culture goes mainstream." I think that refers very directly to the things that Simon was that brought up in his talk. To carry on with Bazalgette, "We expect the bigger organisations to play a leading role. We need people who will spread good practice. Agents for change, we call them, working across organisations, bringing people and ideas together and enabling creative evolution through the national portfolio," by which he means the organisations that are funded by the Arts Council. "To deliver the most exciting, inspirational and, yes, excellent art for everyone, we must draw on the best talent from every part of our country and think about every aspect of our work and how it is interrelated. How the diversity of our programming gives ownership to our audiences, how they will inspire young talent, and how they become our future generation of cultural leaders." So this is a large 20 million pound initiative by the Arts Council of England to encourage arts organisations to employ more Black, Asian, minority and ethnic, BAME, it's conventionally understood, workers within the institutions that are currently set up. Okay, so what's wrong with that? That sounds like a very good direction. That sounds like something that everybody should be behind. It's certainly something that's been lobbied for within the black arts community for a long time, and not necessarily within cultural organisations, and it follows types of initiative that have been put in place by the Arts Council previously, such as the Decibel scheme and the Inspire scheme, whereby young people that were black, Asian, minority, ethnic were given grants, and institutions were given grants in order to educate them into the ways of institutional practices. So, on one surface, one level, it sounds like a very good initiative from the Arts Council of England. But I think we need to examine the language that Bazalgette is using, which is, of course, symptomatic of the language of power and the language of institutional power and its economic structures within the UK. And we need to ask, what kind of we is Bazalgette constructing through the use of this language? How does it maintain the paternalistic and power-laden custodial relation between the providers and recipients of culture? And this concept of the custodial, of course, comes from Grant Kester, who Simon has previously discussed. How does this language and this rhetoric, and therefore its procedures, its processing of the people and the we, how does it reduce the complexity of the affective and political registers of self-organisation and aesthetic intervention to the terms of leadership and meritocracy? So the climbing of the ladder, the climbing to the top, the training of our future leaders, our artistic leaders, our institutional leaders, one could say also our political leaders, of course, because there's not much difference effectively from the language Bazalgette is using, and dare I say it, the language that David Cameron would use in a similar type of speech. Okay? And I guess more importantly, and I want to talk about meritocracy today, how does this kind of action on the part of the Arts Council of England, effectively the controllers of the dispersal of culture within the UK, how does it retain inequality through the encouragement and the programming of meritocracy, getting to the top, becoming a leader, becoming a black leader? So what is the we, and what we is Bazalgette constructing in the name of diversity, this term diversity? Who are these people? How does this complicate the idea of what is former? How does it complicate what is former? What is former within this? Well, we could say, on one level, one easy way to answer that question would be to say, well, Bazalgette is former. He belongs to the former. He belongs to everything that Maria described in her summary of what is we need to get beyond to move over. Bazalgette is former, yeah? We could also say that the concept of putting diversity into leadership is also a version of the former, yeah? It's not lateral, it's hierarchical, it maintains structures that belong to the culture of the former, that we are predisposed today and tomorrow to think beyond, okay? So if that's former, what is post? Simon has already introduced this concept of the post into the discussion, so I'm going to do it again. And I'm going to do it through Stuart Hall. Okay, so I'm going to quote from Stuart Hall from a paper that he gave at the Tate in 2001 at a conference that is interestingly titled, in relationship to our subject today and tomorrow, Museums of Modern Art and the End of History. Okay, this is a very 2001 type of title, okay, so we have to kind of go with it, all right? And to a certain extent, we need to go with the way that Stuart Hall describes culture, because I think it's very located in 2001, which I always think is quite close past, but actually is quite a long way in the past now. Okay, so this paper is published in an Institute of International Visual Art publication called Annotation, sadly no longer with us anymore, but a very important publication that carried on for some years after INAVA was initially established. He gave it, and it was published again in 2001. And the edition is called Modernity and Difference. Again, a very 2001 kind of title, but we'll come back to it. So I'm going to quote Stuart Hall on in response to my question, what is the post? Okay? So Hall says in this conference about museums and the end of history, he says post is the aftermath or the afterflow of a particular configuration. This is a very Hallian concept, a configuration. The post-colonial is not the end of colonialism, and I'm quoting this in direct response to this intricate relationship between the post and the former. Post-colonial is not the ending of colonialism, but what happens after the end of the national independence movement. He's referring there, of course, to the history of colonization. All these contradictions, to carry on with Hall, all these contradictions and problems which constituted the dependency of colonial societies are reconvened, partly now within the old colonial societies, and now, of course, he's talking about the UK, amongst others, but also inside the metropolis, which was previously regarded as standing outside of this process. Hall reminds us, and I think this is a very interesting thing to think about in relationship to what we understand artists to do and curators to do in relationship to the concept of the former. Hall reminds us, to quote him again, a practice is always a labour, a work on pre-existing materials and traces. And this is very important in Hall's concept and configuration of the ways in which the former and the post operate together, particularly within the context of the UK and its complex relationship to migrancy, racism, colonialism, and questions of inequality. I'm going to read one more quote, and this is a very famous quote from Stuart Hall. In reality, the world is absolutely littered by modern... I'm going to start again. In reality, the world is absolutely littered by modernities and practicing artists. So it's littered by modernities and practicing artists who never... I guess there's other things in there too, other people as well as artists. But in reality, the world is absolutely littered by modernities and practicing artists who never regarded modernity as the secure possession of the West, but perceived it as a language that was both open to them, but which they would have to transform. The history should therefore now be rewritten as a set of cultural translations rather than as a universal movement which can be located securely within a culture, within a history, within a space, within a chronology, and within a set of political and cultural relations. Okay? So, this is, in a way, Hall's prehistorical response to Peter Bazalgette, I would say. If we can read history backwards, then we could say that this is Hall, who of course sadly is no longer with us, preempts Bazalgette's speech to the arts community in December 2014. So it's a kind of interesting temporal loop that's going on. Okay, so to talk very quickly about INIVA, the Institution of International Visual Arts. Well, of course, it was set up by a group of artists that were concerned with the lack of not simply representation but articulation of the complexities of colonizations and modernities within the UK and globally in 1994, and its first chair, its founding chair, was Professor Stuart Hall. So it was set up to make arguments for issues of race, making the fact of blackness, to quote Fanon, a complex issue in Britain's modernity and its cosmopolitical relation to the global. And Barbie Asante has handed me this morning a paper that she's recently found in the Stuart Hall Library that is located currently, although precariously, at the Institution of International Visual Art, which is effectively the what would you call it, the kind of the set of values or the set of achievements that INIVA wanted to develop at its founding. And one of them says that one of the things that INIVA wanted to do was give priority to those artists who have been ignored and marginalized on the basis of race, gender, and cultural difference, amongst other things. So it was set up to develop quite complex relationships. It wasn't set up necessarily as a representational institution that was going to show black artists because they weren't shown at Tate. Remember, Tate was set up, it was founded, in 2000, so this is a kind of pre-Tate establishment, if one can possibly imagine the world before the Tate. Okay? So, which I find difficult to do. Okay, so what Innover set out to do, and this is really important, and I'm going to come back to this, what Innover set out to do was not ask who is the we, not necessarily, well, to ask who is the we, but not to say we are the we as opposed to the them. So to come back to that ontological division that Maria proposed that we need to think about, or whether we're past it, the ontological division between the us and the them, the we and the them, the people and the people, we could say, or one sector of the people as opposed to another sector of the people. So it was set up very specifically and very contentiously. Innover was very contentious from its founding moment. Many, many artists said that they didn't want to be part of it, and many were very for it. But it asked not who is the we, not who is the cohesive people in terms of assimilation, parce Bazalgette, Bazalgette's proposition of meritocratic ascendancy for people of black, Asian, minority and ethnic backgrounds within the current conditions of art. That's what I would call an assimilationist process. That's not what Innover wanted when it set up, but in terms of difference, or as Stuart Hall said in the paper that I just quoted from, referencing Derrida, and this is also why it's very 2001, différence. So that's what Innover was set up to do, to think about difference, not assimilation, how difference is spread and migrates through cultures, artistic cultures, forms of cultural working, in ways that cannot be captured by current institutions. That's what was set up to do, in terms of how we can reinvent the terms of being with each other in both political and aesthetic ways. Now, Innover has been diminished. It's been reduced, it's been cut. It received a 60% cut to its funding in May 2014, and that followed from a previous cut. It's been radically reduced and diminished as part of a cultural landscape in the UK. Some would say very deliberately. And most importantly, though, I think, for the argument I'm trying to propose today, it's been diminished intellectually. It's been reduced intellectually by mismanagement and lack of investment over 10 years, notwithstanding the many brilliant artistic and curatorial interventions that have happened within it, recently and in the past. But most importantly, it's been reduced by meritocratic ascendancy within management culture in the UK. Innover is now, if it survives, and if it can't be transformed, and there are many of us trying to lobby for its transformation, it will be, and it already is, the poor imitation of its grander cousin. So effectively, it's been reduced to an institution that is attempting to look like Tate, be like Tate, and work in the administrative and managerial processes that are encapsulated by organisations such as Tate and many others. And institutions are forced to work in this way because of their funding agreements. So it's seeking private patronage and not doing very well. It's attempting to keep face using the language of survival, inimical to the funded arts sector. It's adopting entrepreneurial methodologies, or attempting to, and employing fundraisers one after the other. Innover is now symptomatic of a culture that makes arts administrators and managers, and through them, artists and curators, custodians and gatekeepers of the people, in the way that Simone described earlier on. So how did this happen? So I'm just going to finally end with a few comments on meritocracy, because for me this is one of the problems we face. How do we, I think in order to think through the former, we need to understand the granularity of meritocracy within the culture that we need to get rid of in order to proceed, in order to transform concepts of we and the people. And that's not just in arts organisations, of course, that's also in education institutions, where we learn how to rise to the top. That's what we sell education on. So So in discussing the political effects of meritocracy, Paul Gilroy, in a paper he wrote for New Formations in 2013, has noted that the semantic turn from talking about and acknowledging racial difference to discussing diversity and plurality. So exactly this shift from 1994 Innover to Peter Bazalgette in 2014, this shift from acknowledging racial difference to discussing diversity and plurality. Paul Gilroy says that this gives access to new markets, new clients, and new capital. But it also necessitates, and this is very important, I think, and something that I think we will carry on discussing in further panels today and tomorrow, this move through and to meritocracy necessitates a privatization of resistance. So in other words, what Gilroy is saying is meritocracy divides us. Okay, so think about this in relationship to the concerns of allowing cultural diversity to rise to the top. So this article, Gilroy's article, is an analysis of particularly black male participation in leadership programs and Dragon's Den type television programs in the UK and the US. So this is the context that he's talking about, which is of course not the art context, but I think is easily transferable. He says the use of marketing techniques to change the negative media portrayal of black men is, for him, to quote him, symptomatic of neoliberalism's preference for post and virtual sociality over the slow labour of building solidarity over time. That's the end of that quote. This in turn affects, to quote him again, the replacement of imperfect democracy, maybe this goes back to Laclau, imperfect democracy by what we are told is the non-negotiable force of natural hierarchy. So this is also relates to Bazalgette. It is the embodiment of meritocracy, its literal incorporation with within the bodies and the souls of the people, that is us, those of us that work in and alongside arts institutions, concomitant with the erosion of what Gilroy names as solidarity that has been eradicated from the Innover Project, as well as many other smaller, less declamatory arts organisations across the UK. Maybe this also relates to what Simon was talking about in relationship to the community and community art. Art's economic infrastructure comes to dominate the ways in which arts institutions operate. It becomes more and more impossible to imagine and instigate ways in which we might organise and work together and reorganise what our institutions do. Meritocracy removes the contextual and historical basis of any individual or collective emergence. It produces a landscape of individuals whose randomized ascent is based on autonomy. Autonomy is an attribute that is privately earned. Gilroy talked about this, the privatization of resistance. Self-learned and styled, it is not reliant on others. There is no way in which a we can emerge from it. If this is therefore the alternative we, or the we that is being peddled and promoted, both consciously and unconsciously, if institutions can have consciousnesses, which is debatable, but anyway, let's say they can, through arts institutions, we must find models of in the former, such as the early and often contradictory and sometimes compromised experiments that were started at Innover in 1994 in order to build the post. Thank you very much.